Well, welcome everyone to the Permaculture Education for Climate Safe and Just Future. And this is a conversation that I've been looking forward to share with Rosemary Morrow, who's joining us here from the Blue Mountains. I'm calling in from the unceded lands of the Gubbi Gubbi here in the Sunshine Coast, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and just really deeply acknowledge the thousands of generations of care for the earth, care for the waters, the air and the biodiversity. And where are you calling in from? I know you're in the Blue Mountains, but what country are you on, Ro?
Well, I'm on Gundungurra land, and I've made a bit of an effort to learn the language, which is an invitation to join in. So Yangu Bora Mangu Yakanji, which means please will you come and join us in this circle. So that's the introduction I can give from the Blue Mountains, where we at least have 1 million hectares of national park, showing how wonderful land can be when we refrain from damage and use it not as a commodity. So I think we're very lucky to be here.
Thank you for that beautiful welcome, and that you've actually taken the effort to learn the language as well. And I know that a lot of here in Australia, there's people calling from around the world, but in Australia, that is something that a lot of people are really making an effort to do, and also to know what the name of their local name of places, of rivers. So the next to me here is what's known currently as the Mary River, but it's also the Mukabulla River, and it's uncovering these names over time, and it's becoming more and more accessible. And I even know that even on the Australia Post, they're making space for people to write what country they're from, which I think is absolutely brilliant. So welcome, Rosemary Morrow, to this masterclass. This is the 40th masterclass that we've held every month. For the last 40 odd months, we've been hosting these, and it's been so it's an absolute delight to welcome you here tonight to explore really this concept of the value of permaculture education, particularly in marginal communities, in a way of creating climate safety and social justice. So I think maybe somewhere to begin would be, I know most people know you, but perhaps we could just begin with a little bit about your background in permaculture, because for as long as I've known permaculture, since I can remember, your name has been a firm fixture there as an author, as an educator, as someone who's doing permaculture development work. Could you just speak just a moment or two about your life in the permaculture world, Ro?
Oh, thank you, Morag. What a lovely invitation. It's lovely to see so many people here. I always feel, I love this, hand on the heart. It's an honour when people come to listen to you. I always wonder whether it's worthwhile, and their time and their effort. So thank you, everyone who has come to this session. It's really wonderful of you. So I came from agricultural science 37 years ago to permaculture. Since then, it's colonised my mind and my life and my garden and my friends and my community. So it has become a life. On the other hand, I remain critical and selective, I think. I don't want permaculture to be the best thing on earth if there's something better. So I keep an eye open all the time in case there's something as good or better emerging on the sidelines. I think permaculture, I realised through the last 5 years or so, permaculture must change if it's going to serve all people equally. And so for those years, I've been working much more about justice in learning, justice in access to permaculture, and justice in project running, the whole thing. I've noticed what's come to fore for me, Morag, has been the colonial nature of a lot of permaculture. And I think I must still be colonial because of my age and times. I'm growing old in permaculture. But I try to be aware and a little bit listen to others and find out what's happening.
And we're going to find out hopefully a little bit later about your new book. But perhaps we could begin a little bit with one of your key focuses has been around teaching permaculture teachers. So not just teaching permaculture itself. So can you maybe just spend a bit of time exploring with us why you think teaching permaculture teachers is so important?
Well, you know, on first thought, I might assume that it's so we keep the content pure and unadulterated and it succeeds through. It's not. I came to it because there was a group of teachers who were very much teaching from a place at the front we call chalk and talk, or sage on the stage. And that can be really good. A good lecture when you want it is excellent. I'm not putting that down. But if you really want people to learn, I think it's absolutely important we practice the permaculture ethics. Care of people. Are you bored? Do you know this? Am I speaking too fast? People in the chat room can provide me with information. Using the wrong vocabulary. Am I making it difficult for you to learn? Are you engaged in your learning? Seemed to me that if you're going to teach people and just talk, and at the end they remember 15%, then you're wasting your time. If people are engaged in the learning, and I'm very keen on care of people, listening to everyone's voice, creating a learning community where people can come together and share, and they can take that away, especially in hostile environments where, you know, I first came against this in Vietnam, where people from the south who'd been in retraining prisons, re-education, were meeting with people from the north. And I found that you could develop a classroom where at the end they'd let that go. So there was a peace issue in that, more learner-centred than teacher-centred training. So that was my main interest, actually, more than even content.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that thread that you just mentioned there at the end around peace. And the more that I've been working with permaculture communities in refugee settlements, the more I realize how important that element of permaculture education is and how impactful it can be in those contexts. And I actually came to permaculture as a teenage peace activist, and that's how I ended up in permaculture. So peace is a big part of what you do, isn't it, Ro?
Well, I'm a Quaker. I am bitterly opposed to all wars. If we haven't evolved as humans to a place where we have to go and kill each other, I'm grossly disappointed in the human race. So I am disappointed. But I can say, first when I went to Cambodia, we had some families there who'd been Khmer Rouge. We had families who'd lost individuals who'd lost all their families, and they were the same community who'd been killed by the people who were, you know, you had to bring people together again, whatever the wound. And you had to have people together again and talking, and they had to be looking to a future. So you develop a process rather than a content. So instead of saying you must talk to each other and be friends and forget it, which you can't do, it's much better to say work in such a way that you can move on and encompass a vision which is tangible and possible and everyone can get behind. So now working with, you know, Afghanistan at one stage, working with Narani in peace activists, working with peace communities around the world to bring permaculture has been a critical part. And that was my commitment when I first went overseas, Vietnam, Cambodia, East Timor, that I believed that the permaculture learning could create arts of peace that had to be relearned. The tools and gifts of peace can be relearned through a permaculture process rather than give them special peace studies. Though I have done nonviolent communication and body behaviour and all those things, it is much more about that. Bring together in a space where peace can be created through working on soils.
Absolutely. And, you know, what I hear all the time too, people talking about, you know, they've been part of peace studies programs in these camps, but have been nowhere near as effective as actually engaging in these locally led hands-on permaculture programs that are bringing people together to work together for something looking forward. But I wonder, when you say that, that war is something that you absolutely despise, how have you ended up in so many war-torn places, Ro? I mean, you have been to more places that have been absolutely devastated by war and right on the front line of a lot of these places, putting yourself personally in quite a bit of danger. How have you landed in that space, and how do you cope being in that place? Because it's quite confronting, I can imagine.
Yeah, it's confronting, and it's sort of nightmarish. I don't want to present myself as a brave, wonderful woman who goes to places and lives with danger, but there are things. Landmines go up very close, and guns are shot randomly, AK-47s, and there are all sorts of things happen. It's not that. It's rather that this sort of life during war or after war is a violence against the people. And it's not the violence, it's in the recovery phase, and it's in the war phase that we need to be there. And as you say, I don't think it's any good saying you shouldn't fight and don't do this. We say, come on, we're going to get together and we're going to refute that by living this. Now, I know someone in Barcelona, peace activist for many years in America, who gave it up to work for permaculture as a much better tool for peace than actually telling people they have to be peaceful. Because if you can get your mind into a project that has wonderful outcomes and work with others, I think you're way ahead.
And so your work has taken you to be particularly focused on what you call, I don't know, it's like edge communities or working on the edge. And I've heard you often talk about this being something that you feel as being one of the places where we need to pay so much more attention with our permaculture education and with our energy, rather than just kind of looking after ourselves. Like, there's this huge need in the world. And how can people sort of get into that a bit more? I mean, you've taken decades to find your way into that, and I know that there's probably so many people who would love to be doing that. What advice could you give people who kind of see that as something that they would like to be moving towards?
Well, you do it, Morag. You're a partner in crime in this, creating peace and working through these. I just like to start the feeling of what I'm calling an edge community. That is probably even a colonial expression that I'm using, because really those what I'm calling edge communities, the huge cities, the people in camps, they are more the majority. The poor are more the majority than the Western advantage. I think one day I looked at the class and I thought, no one here is going to have 5 acres. No one here is going to own a house and garden. They're going to live in a tent. They're going to live in a shifting thing. They're going to live in a container perhaps for the rest of their lives. So I wouldn't want to say that to them. They're going to live under all sorts of control. People in the working migrants in Abu Dhabi, in Singapore, in the factories of these countries, these are the majority of most of the world. And where's permaculture going to teach them and work with them? Well, it isn't. We're still saying in your garden you put the lemon tree here and the curb path there. It's got to change or it's going to die. And that was my conviction. While we keep talking to a European model of people with advantage, we are losing the plot. So what does it take to give you a different permaculture altogether, but still not lose the principles and the ethics and the knowledge that's in communities? So that's what took me. Actually, I think the word edge is wrong. It probably should be back to that sense of the majority world is not us. And that's what we have to hold in our heads always, I think. And that people like Permaculture or Malaysia or India, and that they're doing the real work and they're adjusting, and we continue to say it sort of be like us. Yeah, that's what took me there. And then things had to change from there.
Can you describe what permaculture looks like in a refugee settlement that's just tense? Like, what does that look like, and how do you even begin to teach permaculture in that context, Ro, or in a place like Afghanistan? And I know you've been there and taught permaculture there too.
It's now run to a stop, by the way, and that is a huge sadness. You work with people over several years, you keep contact with your students, you're talking to them, you might be doing special times and encouragement or getting them a bit of money, and now under the Taliban, stop, just stop. And that is a tragedy, because now's the moment they need it, and I always thought if they needed it, they'd have that beginning. So this is one of the sadnesses. So you can't actually build your teaching on what you want to achieve. It has to be whether the material is good for the people in that situation. Does that make sense? It can be all about me wanting to transform Afghanistan or refugee, or it can be, is there something of value that can be carried to the people and they can make it their own? So it has to get right away from ego stuff. You can't build your empire and your name on that. It has to, if it wasn't working, I wouldn't do it. I really wouldn't. I'm not going to, just my dream, my mission, my thing. But I think we learnt two things, Morag. We learnt how to teach. That's one thing. And then the other thing was we learnt what impacts and lasts. So if you go into a refugee camp or a war-torn settlement, it's usually filthy rivers, muddy streams. Sometimes you have plastic in the ground up to 1 metre deep, so it's had time to build up. So you dig down to plant a tree, and there are plastic bags in the ground 1 metre deep. The rivers are just full. Out of Erbil in Afghanistan, you've got a hill that must be nearly 100 metres high with 300 ml plastic bottles. You're working in this environment of enormous waste and junk that comes in, with people controlled, with wet, muddy situations and terrible danger, because the camp burnt down in Morrow in Greece. The camp burnt down. 10,000 people were hurt in Cox's Bazar. We don't have all the solutions, and I suppose I'll just stop there for a moment, let someone or you come in with something, but it really is constrained. If you've got a tent and a door and 8 people living in that room and muddy water and slip everywhere, that's what you're dealing with. Their zone zero, when you teach it, might be just to put a mat up on the ceiling when it's too hot in summer, or get a screen for the door for the bad air, or grow mushrooms on the roof or the window, or in, just in a container like this. That might be a tomato and a bean. You start thinking about what is possible with all the constraints, instead of thinking, I'm going to teach them zone 1, zone 2, zone. You don't. You're constantly adapting that you must have the equivalent of kitchen garden stuff.
And yet, isn't it interesting too that, that's Cox's Bazar, and then Afghanistan is a different situation, and then Syria again, the Syrian refugees, that's another. And then over in the African refugee settlements, there's another situation too. I mean, a number of the people, some of you might be here today or listening to the recording, that have actually a space for a garden. So, for example, when the refugees land in Uganda from the Democratic Republic of Congo, they get a piece of land to build a hut and a garden space. And so there's been actually a number of new arrivals coming with all the increased violence that's going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there's thousands of people flooding into the camps at the moment. We're not hearing about them because we're hearing about the other war, which is devastating in Ukraine. But what we're trying to do is find a way to access tools, seeds, resources that are starter kits. And the teachers are on the ground ready to go to teach the new arrivals and to kind of induct them into a sort of permaculture gardening process. So there's different contexts, isn't there, in each different place, and looking at this displacement. There's displacement within a country. There's displacement, between countries in a region. I mean, most of the refugees in Africa, for example, are just in Africa itself, not moving out of that country. And then you've got climate refugees as well. So the number of displaced people is growing rapidly all around the world.
So the work we do in your part of this, Morag, in Permaculture for Refugees, is try to develop certain sorts of guidelines that could go to the UNHCR or WVI or Red Cross, Red Crescent, any of these organisations that have the power to change what presently happens. And what we're trying to establish is that what we have done in this sort of experimental phase is to lay out the things that are really, really important, especially if future tragedy hides those camps and disasters and they're stuck, and that they can do that again, even if no one's there. For example, one of the things I would say is absolutely vital is every single project needs a seed growing component in camps and settlements that stands alone from relying on, because COVID showed us that. The transport broke down, the markets broke down, people couldn't even get seed to do the minimal things in camps. There have to be seed banks in everywhere in the world, actually, for the reasons that are most cogent for refugees, but for the rest of us as well. Some things have sprung out as being critical bones that you must build on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that the projects that I'm working with that is at the core now. Seed saving, seed exchange network, this digital network too of people between camps and people moving from camp to camp, starting to exchange these seeds that they have access to. And I think that is a really important thing. I just noticed there's a question actually, Ro, that's come up and maybe we can drop that in here. So this is a question from Mark Decker. He's saying, carrying capacity of the planet often comes up in discussion. Do you feel 8 billion people can be fed using permaculture practice? Thank you, Mark.
Mark, that's a really good question. It comes up a lot. And the whole question has often been the competition between population and consumption. The more people that copy the rich world, the fewer people we can carry on Earth. So once everyone wants air conditioning, and why shouldn't they? It's that the rich need to modify their lifestyle and the poor need to be given better access. Carrying capacity, Mark, is very much the question of population. If you can supply water and there's energy and there's food for a certain number of people, then they can live well, and that includes wilderness and non-human species, all species. So what we're looking about is, can your local area, a camp or a regional area or a dry area or a drought or anything, can it carry all the waste? Can it provide the energy? Can it clean the water? Can its capacity? I'm sorry, my phone's ringing for a minute. It'll just interrupt this segment a little bit. I'll just let it go. But it always cuts the transmission. But really starting to think what you can carry on that land, what you consume and what you can waste, and grey water putting out. That's the big question. So there isn't an ideal answer about 8 billion. There's a much better answer on considering the variables that we call systems analysis. And can the land that you're talking about carrying that? If not, we'd better modify behaviour, all of us. Oh, Mark, thank you. I just saw your answer.
Did you see an answer there, did you? Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm watching.
Just flashed up.
All right. Wonderful. And Russ Grayson's just mentioned too that they have a farmer seed exchange that was set up as a food security program. That's right, in the Solomon Islands. An amazing project over there, Russ, and I hope it's still going strong. So yes, I mean seed is huge. Bemariki. Oh, it's nice to see you here, Bemariki. Saying his connection's not so strong, so he's going to wait for the recording, but. It's probably that you could join us here. So Bemariki is someone that we work with very closely over in Ramwanja refugee settlement in Uganda, and is kind of leading a lot of the programs over there. So lovely for him to be here. So I guess I want to focus a little bit on the education, permaculture education, and really bringing into focus that the third ethic of fair share. And I can see Meg's also here as well. And I spoke at Meg's organisation recently about this third ethic. And I think it's something that perhaps we could all pay far more attention to. You know, what you were just talking about is that, you know, the earth care. So how can we care for people within the planetary boundaries? But also I want to bring in that sort of that social justice element, the fair share element. How would you describe, firstly, I mean, how would you describe fair share, and how do you see it playing out within the permaculture education model that we have, and how can we amplify it even further?
Well, my sense, Morag, and it might be yours too, is that Westerners practice the third ethic far less and less well than people with a bigger communal spirit. And there's something, I had to bring it home to myself really hard. I don't usually personalise things like this, but what I had to do was say, reduce consumption and distribute surplus to need. And now I've got a little light on in my head that said, am I reducing consumption? Am I distributing surplus to need myself? And I've had to practice it because I kept saying it but not doing it. Care of people, care of the earth, you know, I'd been making compost and planting trees. But the actual third ethic is the one that's likely to save the world, if anything, as much as any, you know, I would put it right up for the care of the earth and protect it. But actually saying to yourself, I must reduce my consumption. And I think that needs to come through all Western courses, that people from beginning to end have reduced. You know, I've had people who say we got rid of a car. I've had people say I've got an electric bike. But you keep working on that until it gets actually quite hard. And surplus to need can be justified, but I really like this, or I might need it in the future. I'm not needing it now. There's all this justification that goes on. The actual syllabus for reduced consumption and distribute surplus to need is very weak, and I'm not sure fair share gives that clear instruction that's ethical. The ethical construction is reduced consumption. If we're all very serious, except I'm talking about people in refugee camps who need to, but for those of us who are teaching and working, I think we have to model it, and I think we have to keep examining the lives of our communities all the time to see if this is happening. What do you think?
Well,
we're the big consumers.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, when I think of fair share, it is definitely about us thinking about just that question is, what is enough? And in the context of where you and I live, you know, most of us have way more than enough. And what are the ways in which we can distribute that surplus? I also think about, well, if I'm thinking about how I'm living and the choices and decisions that I'm making in my work, in my family, in my daily life, and in where my money gets spent, all those things, like, is that contributing to the care of the earth? Is it contributing to the care of other people? Is it ensuring quality of life? Is it a fair share in that way? And so I kind of, it's it's just there as a lens to look through every single day.
Mm.
And that's where it comes across for me.
Yeah. One of the most helpful things for me was living in a Buddhist country for quite a long time, Cambodia, where they said, unless something is of real need, the want will go away. So, I want a Cadillac, a Fiat, I want a trip overseas, I want. If you stay with it, it will just often evaporate. You don't want that anymore.
Mm.
But a need, I need to get a decent raincoat, and it's been raining for 6 weeks. You might go to the op shop and find one. So the difference between is that all these wants just float away. And that was a really wonderful understanding from Buddhism for me, and wanting, if you can make do, then you don't need so much either.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you're right too. It's about something about the fulfillment that you get, or the sense of, the sense of being fulfilled by being in community, in relationship, in a meaningful weaving, rather than feeling somewhat of the emptiness of the disconnect. And so that opportunity that we get when we do live within strong communities, and often that is, as you said, in communities that don't have so much stuff that separates us, because the more stuff we have, the more separate we become to kind of protect the stuff that we have, and so you end up with this great disconnect. So I think, allowing a lot of that to fall away and opening the doors and opening the possibilities, and then and like you said, modeling it, but it always makes me feel somewhat awkward at the same time. I mean, you talked about this kind of the colonizer, I sit uncomfortably with that here in Australia, and also in lots of the space, because I do come from a place of privilege. So I'm always very conscious about privilege, and very conscious about how that influences my perspective on things. And really, I think what often you say too is that you spend more time listening than talking in those contexts, and responding rather than directing. And I find that being one of the most useful and integrative approaches that I've been able to find, and actually create beautiful relationships with people across the planet through cultivating communities of practice where this deep listening can take place.
I always say a teacher shouldn't talk more than 15 minutes in any session, because the students are engaged in learning exercises themselves. So you set it up in such a way that you can go around and listen to the conversation, identify perhaps misconceptions or a better way of doing something. But in your listening to the conversations, you can actually bring that in later and fix something. I see us as plugging holes almost in knowledge, because everyone knows something about soil. Everyone knows something about water. Even if they spill a glass, it'll run to the bottom, And often we're talking down to people and not acknowledging their life skills. So learning what they know. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say too, often it's not even necessarily, sometimes it's plugging the gaps, but sometimes it's just asking another question so that we find where that knowledge exists, because it's there. Often it's there, and it's just, opening more spaces for those conversations to happen. So, I think what we're talking about here is a different kind of permaculture education. And not necessarily. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who teach this way, but how do you share these qualities of becoming a permaculture educator in this way, with this kind of heart and patience and listening? So what is your process of teaching permaculture teachers that brings out this approach?
I was lucky enough years ago to do a course called Alternatives to Violence. And the process of that was people would constantly meet in small and big groups all the time and discuss and come back, and would be given exercises to do and come back and bring the results. And that most of the time was spent with the students interacting I'll give an example because this sounds abstract. So, for example, if you're dealing with soils, you might say, we've got soil water, we've got soil particles, we've got organic matter, we've got microorganisms. I want you to go into a group that you like and discuss one of those and come back and put it together on the board. You almost have nothing to teach. Mm-hmm. They're all there saying, well, water, it's attached to organic matter, it's good for the insects, it carries nutrient into the roots. If they don't know, you can add that. In the end, you've got a whole poster on the board, and I can do it in another language when I have an inadequate interpreter. I can pick up what's happening. So it's a matter of giving the learning to the student, not thinking you have to be up there teaching it all. It's enabling learning. Mm-hmm. And I'm passionate about it. And I found the Alternatives to Violence program at telling people where they're going and what we'll be learning, bringing them in, opportunities. And gradually, as a course goes on, you can move yourself out of being the key person. So you start as a teacher in the beginning and say, okay, and people recognise you're keeping them safe. And there are some ground rules. We're not going to allow people to put each other down or talk over each other to the exclusion of others, but we all agree to that and might need reminding. And then we create such an environment that people can largely learn themselves. And by the end of a course, even a 6-day teacher training, I can walk into a room and be unnoticed because the ongoing conversation is there. So you've created a learning community of which you're no longer pivotal. You're there long enough to guide, this is what we need, you're safe, and gradually you're withdrawing from that teaching role.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is absolutely critical, particularly if you're teaching in a, if you're hosting some learning in a place that you don't want it just to stop when you leave, that those sets of relationships. So possibly those people have come from different places, but the process becomes visible enough so that when they move into their own community, they can be taking that process with them. And so, yeah, I think the notion of communities of practice, of learning communities that can continue and have this spark of enthusiasm to be in that process of observing and noticing and questioning and making the space for the multiple voices and the multiple knowledges and the multiple cultures that exist within a room. And I know that, I don't know if Bemariki's still here, but this is something that, he's really excellent at creating that space for the multiple cultures, particularly, people who are refugees from many different places to come in and create a safe space. It's not, I remember actually I was talking with Fritjof Capra recently, and he was talking about how he was, when as a physicist, as a learned physicist, he would often feel quite threatened when he would go into a university environment because he knew when he was about to deliver a lecture that there was people in the audience waiting to pounce and find a hole in his theories and to pull it apart and to rip shreds off him. And so as soon as I shifted into teaching at places like Schumacher College, where it was a learning community, people were coming in and being in dialogue, that it was about us all together lifting each other, and every single part that every single person brought in was something that lifted everyone. It wasn't the competition, it was a space to explore. And I think if we can create that from even before people have entered into a room together, like how you enter into space, what the space is, how you communicate with people as they're arriving, what's the context that you're creating for that learning to take place. And I know that, in some places it can be pretty basic and pretty awful, but yet there's something about the warmth, how you invite people, the invitation to explore and be in awe and wonder. I'm just trying to see, I'm noticing that the chat's kind of going off quite extensively over here, and Meg and Russ and Jane and Lizzie and Clinton and lots of others are having a great conversation over there. I'm sorry I can't read all the comments while you're all there, but I wonder if there are some questions that I haven't missed. I'm going across into the Q&A section. So if you'd like to ask a question, please drop it in the Q&A section, because then I can easily find it in amongst the great stream of chat. So there's a question here from Tanya. How do we amplify this approach to building learning communities within the permaculture space? How do we make that more present?
Well, I found that by having a teacher training course or facilitator training course, and often the facilitator would be in shock if we talked about using sarcasm or control or, all right, everyone, just listen to me. Will you all listen? Listen to me. And we turned it to, would you mind giving me your attention now? That people would say when we were presenting these traditional modes of teaching, you're talking about me, aren't you? And you wouldn't be. But they brought this mode of classroom teaching. I think what we do is just keep teaching it. I think it's absolutely fascinating. How do we bring it? I think the teacher training has been more effective than PDCs in many ways. And look, I'm actually quite strict in my head about outcomes. So whether it's a PDC, I want people to be able to look at a landscape, see whether it's degrading, see where it's restoring, be able to repair rivers, to know where to start. I'm really keen that at the end they are effective in the landscapes they live in, that they're not just had a lovely time and a nice, they actually have skills that will contribute now to the future and interest them for the rest of their lives. And the same thing applies to teacher training. They can take it to a meeting. They can take it into a family reunion where things are going wrong, where they stop saying yes, but, and then they can say, why do you think like that? Or would you like to explain your idea? Just giving people skills to flip a little from what is probably a more Western way of responding to things. So that's, I'm not sure, just I've got more teacher trainers than ever before who are going to go to the Philippines and to Malaysia and to South Africa in the next year, and they are good and wonderful. But we must also do it here because we're a very complex society. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think what you said too about just doing it, when we think about demonstrating permaculture, we often talk about, needing to have demonstration centres and sites and places that where you can see, touch, taste, feel permaculture in action. But we also need to embody that too in the way in which we have permaculture communities and permaculture events and permaculture, the people side, that is demonstrated, and that we always enter into spaces and host spaces with this art. And I think it then brings it in. Yeah.
I've just seen Meg's comment. It's traditionally around the hours of learning how to apply the design process to your own context. In the last few years, I've thought, throw that out. Let's go from, and we keep saying it, from me to we. Let's design our street, and our home is maybe the example, but let's design a bit of our watershed. Let's design this east face. Let's design this bit of the camp. Let's design the 80-story building in one go. Let's permaculture some of those huge residences that exist. Let's look at how we can design for communities, and let's get away from the individual. Let's be in service to our community rather than achieving my own goals for getting so many carrots or cabbages or having the best retrofitted house. My thinking's done this flip to design for community much more than design for me and mine. Although it's an important element in designing to be absolutely concrete about what you're dealing with and not imagine. So you think, does the cold air come in here? That will be so for others. But only as a concrete example to think from. I think we need to expand.
Yeah, and I was having a great conversation with Rupert Reed recently, who's one of the founders of the XR movement, and talking a lot about how the whole Extinction Rebellion movement has opened up the possibilities for us to think differently about things, but the whole activist world has been its own problem in and of itself, that it kind of pushed people away as much as it opened the doors for it. And he was talking about how it's so important now to have what he's calling this, the sort of the moderate flag, or possibly something like a permaculture rebellion, but it is about us being. It's shifting from permaculture being about what I can do for me, but what it is that permaculture can do to create a climate safe future, a socially just future. That yes, we need to create environments that nourish our well-being and our families' well-being, but how does permaculture speak to this global crisis, multiple faced global crisis that we're faced with every day? What does permaculture say about that? And that's kind of a question that I face every day, and I wonder about, and I talk about, and Rupert Read, R-E-A-D. I'm sharing a podcast with him next week, actually, on my Sense Making in a Changing World podcast. Sorry, I'm talking to Linda. Funny if I'm talking to you and I'm talking to people in the chat at the same time. Yeah, so I think that we and the focusing on this climate, what does it mean right now? When you look at the latest IPCC reports and you look at all of the things that we know that are going on, how have you shifted how you're thinking about it, Ro, based on what we know with climate change and the accelerating change, extinctions? Has that shifted anything in you, or is it just like, yes, I knew this is why I do this work?
Look, in the 1970s, I first heard of the Club of Rome, and they were talking about climate change at that time, global warming, and I believed them immediately, and I've never wavered. What I've been appalled at is the lack of pickup and evidence, and the future, Mark's just said it, is going to be really rough. So we need as many people doing it now, because others will copy, as we can get. And it needs to happen on this community level all the time. My commitment is always, there was a philosopher called Karl Popper, and he said that, if we look at life at the bottom, if we work to remove the biggest suffering and poverty, then the whole world moves into a happier place. So I've always thought where people are most disadvantaged, can't get permaculture, locked in by language or anything else, that's where we need to be, and that's where we need to change our teaching too. Because the others, they can get it anywhere. With the web, you could become a PhD permaculturalist in 2 years, just reading every single one of the thousands of websites. What about those who can't access it, who need it most? And by the way, they're first to act. Yeah. So the thing is, what we have found is working with NGOs, working with refugees and local people, the residents, when COVID struck, when fires struck, when illness struck, they kept it going. It wasn't anything to do with us. We're out of it, but because those groups had come together in training, they stayed together afterwards. And that's been critical. It's just so important that I wouldn't touch a project now without trying to include those groups for the different parts they play in sustaining permaculture when things get disastrous.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was one of the things that Rupert Read was saying. He was one of the reviewers of the International Panel of Climate Change report, and the latest report, which is all about adaptation, which interestingly, the cover photo of this latest report is a permaculture eco-village, which I think is really pertinent. And so he was sort of saying, one of his books, he's written 12 books, and one of them was saying the civilization as we know it is over, or something to that effect. But he's saying collapse is not inevitable. It's up to us. We have the capacity, and essentially it's a lot around having a permaculture lens to what we do and applying it to every single thing we do, from personal to the political to the economic to the educational to whatever, and that we really take this permaculture into all of the aspects of our lives, and permaculture education to translate that wherever we are, and to talk about it. And I did just also want to note that I just saw Danny Amani has joined us here, and he's from Nairusu refugee settlement in Tanzania. And I just wanted to really do a shout out for Danny, because his work in Tanzania is absolutely remarkable. He's been one of the students of Bemariki, and then he's also a member of the Permaculture Education Institute, and he's always at the events that we run. And he's actually gone back to his refugee settlement, started to teach introduction to permaculture workshops, and we're waiting for some funding to be able to get Bemariki down there to run courses at all the camps. But in the meantime, he ran these introduction courses, and at one of those, there was a girl whose father or uncle ran the education department through all of the camps, and said, Danny, you need to get permaculture into all the schools throughout all the camps in Tanzania. So that's what he's charged to do now. And so we're trying to find funding for him to be able to go to every school, to set up permaculture, to train permaculture teachers to be in every school, because the kids go to school, they haven't had breakfast, they have no food all throughout the day, and then they go home for their one meal a day. So he's saying, well, let's get gardens in the schools, learning the skills so they can go and get gardens at home as well. And so we've managed to get funding so far for 4 schools, and hopefully soon many more. So just congratulations, Danny. It's just remarkable work that you're doing, and thank you for continuously updating us on your fabulous work. I'm looking forward to sharing many of the pictures with people soon. John McKenzie, hello, John. John's saying up here, is doing a needs-led permaculture design useful in this conversation? Hear what communities see as their need to respond to that. Teaching PDC everywhere carries a risk of having limited local relevance. That's right. And so, Ro, what's your response to that about, I never see the idea of ever teaching the same thing twice. So like it's always locally contextualized in my mind, but I wonder what your approach is.
Well, hello, John. How are you? Wonder what you're doing these days. Needs can be difficult. I remember when I was in Vietnam working for Vacvina, Vào Uong Chuông, and I was there for many years, so I really picked up that reference in the list. That when we asked people what they needed, often they were in the country and they would say things like, we need plums. And I'd say, you're hungry? Yes. Were your grandmother hungry? Yes. Was your mother hungry? Yes. Would you like to grow enough food to feed yourselves? And they say yes. They hadn't seen it as a possibility. So needs-led can be very attractive. But remember, you're often bringing something rather special that people could use. So if you're talking about food, for example, you might say, what are the 10 easiest to grow vegetables? What are the best trees that give you yield over time when there's droughts and flood? Get people to provide their own knowledge. And then you'll say, okay, how do you propagate it? What's the seed? Has it got a saleable product? And they answer all those subsidiary questions that take them to know whether this is a good product or not. I believe the PDC is a very, very good tool because it covers so much. But when it gets to the working on details, you have to ask the questions about local relevance, because you don't have to flip the course to teach it, as you would teach in your backyard in Melbourne, John. That would be a big mistake. It's letting people do it their way. So with Vacvina, the Vào Uong Chuông, that would be around the pond and then around the fence and the medicinal plants, but still an excellent permaculture design based on needs and based on access and energy resources and stuff. So you've got it all there, but there are other things that permaculture can bring.
I just realised there's a bit of a preponderance of questions here, so I'm going to just start hitting the ground running, and let's see if we can keep up. I'm going back to a few. Okay, so we've got Fiona here. Fiona is saying, in terms of developing a climate-safe and just future, do we need to explore economic systems in our courses similar to what Bill did through the Earth Bank initiative?
Absolutely fundamental. We've got to break capitalism somehow. And the best way we can do it is in our bioregional systems. And Bill was onto something very, very important there. Maybe in this age of electronics and things, we might need to change it, but we should really withdraw, boycott every way possible from the capitalism at the moment where companies run the world and run countries and us. So that has to go. Local banks may be possible, cooperatives, Yes, a brilliant question. Thank you. That's terrific. And it's a key to really making a new future.
There's a new currency that we've been playing with called Seeds, and it's a digital currency, and it's based out of Europe. And I know that that's been able to support some of the projects in the refugee settlements. However, the problem is that it only is working at the moment if they're able to get their seeds and cash them in and use that cash, because digital currency infrastructure is not in the camps yet. It's only just, it's a cash, totally cash. So, I wonder whether there's a way of local currencies could possibly work. I think that's something we need to be working on a whole lot more. There's a question here from Rosanna Silvestro. Hello, Morag and Rosemary. Can you please offer any advice on fundraising for starter kits to run in refugee camps and funds for essentials needed to start food forest permaculture gardens, please? So fundraising, starter kits.
I haven't run into this exactly like that because we're still trying to build the trainers and COVID really stopped that. So I think that what I would fund would be a seed bank because I regard it as so important, and maybe some training workshops. Remember, there's huge boredom, uncertainty and lack of direction in camps. So anything people can do, they will run with. We have also found that very small amounts are so effective. They're absolutely brilliant. So small amounts with product. We have actually supplied things. UNHCR in some camps will supply things like buckets or rakes or spades. And I'm just thinking of the different contexts that things would be needed in some. Morag, you can speak more to that perhaps from Africa.
Yeah, well, what has come forward in a lot of that is like just needing the tools and seeds and basic starting equipment, watering equipment to be able to get gardens started, and so that then the next layer can emerge. And so our starter kits have been around that. And what we've done to be able to do the fundraising is to share the story about what that community is trying to do, why they need it, how much it costs per kit, per child, per family, and do it as a kind of like a crowdfunding thing. And so people, when they hear, oh, okay, well, it only costs $50 for this entire starter kit for this garden, for this family, oh, that makes sense. That's doable. I can do that. Or maybe I can support 3 families to get started. And so making it, sharing the story and sharing what it is that's trying to be done and what basic equipment is needed to do it, and just keeping it simple like that is kind of the starting point, I think. And I just keep asking, what's the next thing? What do you need now? What do you need now? And honestly, I never have enough funds to support the work. I always have so many requests flooding my inbox, and I'm always consistently feeling dreadful that I don't have enough to share. I think I mentioned there's a link I popped in that was ethosfoundation.org.au. Someone was asking before. So 100% of the funds that I receive go across. I always cover all of the administration costs, and I volunteer all my time to do all of that. 100% goes across to the camps, and there's never enough. And so, I sometimes wish wistfully that, someone would say, Morag, I've got $100,000 here. Do you think you could use that? I said, yes, of course. Can you give me double that per year? Would be great. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, what we've done, Morag, is in the PDC, we've put in money for a follow-up project and money for materials for follow-up. So it's incorporated. So the cost of a PDC in Aussie dollars for 40, 50 people and getting people there and getting the training is about $10,000. But if we took out the foreign teachers because they're in camps, we can release that to seed and materials. So we haven't tried to raise money afterwards. We've provided it right at the beginning. So that's the way we've done it. Yeah. And PermaFund is doing some nice work as well. Thanks, Russ.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, I'm going to keep scanning up. I see that we're right on the 8 o'clock, our 8 o'clock. So I'm just going to scan quickly. And, I know this is thank you, everyone, for all of your questions and for being here and participating so fully in the chat and in the questions. It's a really rich conversation. There's so much more that we could talk about, Ro. Let me just see. I'm just going to drop down a bit. So Chaitali, I saw something there. How to work with people who are unwilling to learn. When we've identified that introducing permaculture to them is going to make a difference. So, and then the next part, she's saying she's trying to work with 17 to 18-year-olds who scream when they see worms. How do we gracefully approach that? So that's when, sometimes people come to it and they've come because they want to learn. Other people are there because they're maybe made to be there. How do you approach that? How do you warm people up who are a bit standoffish?
Well, with the young people who are often a bit disenchanted in our society or anywhere, we run the first course, even if the numbers are small. By the time we're 2/3 of the way through, people are, I want to be part of your course. Please let me in. This sounds great fun. Why wasn't I asked? Why wasn't I included? So every PDC ends up with a long waiting list that we often can't fulfill. So we've never, ever had a course where people have dropped out or failed. But, in these special situations, English fails, computer science fails, all the things you'd think people want fail. Permaculture, it just never runs down. We find people sneaking in the door and sitting on the window ledge because they want to hear. So that sort of doesn't worry me. The word of mouth will bring people in on a project very, very quickly.
There's a number of other questions, and I'm sorry if I've skipped over them because I think we just have one last question here and then we should wrap it up. And if you want to keep asking questions, feel free to kind of email your questions in. I'll pop my email in the chat and maybe Ro and I can kind of answer a couple of extra if there's any desperate ones that you'd like to ask. But I'd like to sort of try and keep our time respectfully to what we said we would do. So the last question is from Vanessa Denzel. It says, I'm fairly new to permaculture, just finishing a PDC, and I've been asked to help design a community garden, which I'm enjoying the process of. Every day I drop my daughter off at school and see the potential for a permaculture learning centre at her primary school. My question is, should I take the leap and approach the school about the space, or should I ask more experienced permaculturists if they'd help with the project? What do you say, Ro?
Well, I think there are many people on this call who would have views and ideas, but what I would want to do is design it with the school community so that it's got continuity, because the child will finish at grade 6 and go on, and then the gardens stop. So I'd want to involve some teachers and some parents and some children, and I'd want to teach them the PDC, so at the end they've designed it, they present it to the school. It's what we do in the camps. People design it, they present it to the camp, they present it to each other. I don't design anything for anyone, ever. I teach them to do the design. So I would be thinking, how can I turn this school to have some really solid designers in here that are going to work through understanding the children and the knowledge they will gain from that. I'd love to make it endemic in the school, a PDC in a way that children are always designing and learning design.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Ro. And that's actually what I did at the local school where my kids went to for a while. And we walked around, we noticed things, we got pieces of paper and we played with it. We walked the contours, we watched the sun, we got the mums and dads to come along, and the grandmothers and the grandfathers and the uncles, and talk to the local farmers to see what resources they had or local knowledge, because there's multiple generations, and talk to the teachers about how they could integrate it with their English and their maths and their and it took time. it wasn't just it took a period of time, and we just mapped it out over a while. And no one got a PDC out of that, like a permaculture design certificate. But I reckon the kids probably well and truly deserved it after what they did, and they created a beautiful garden in that space. And it carried on for a long time. And what I noticed was that after a little while, though, when that group graduated and there wasn't the follow through with the knowledge of the design thinking, it just went into more. So you need to keep that design thinking going. So, after I'd left the school and after my kids had left the school, like that, somehow that education, so there needs to be follow-up. There needs to be that community of practice over time. Yeah. Look, thank you, Ro. Gosh, it's always such a delight to spend this time with you. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Like I said, being part of this conversation. There's always so much to speak about. Before you go, though, Ro, I just want you to let us know what's happening with your latest book.
It's about to go to print. It's more than 500 pages, and I don't know how it got that big. But over the years, I've just learned how much is missing from permaculture. We don't do enough on environmental water, bores, getting it into the groundwater. We don't do enough on river rehabilitation. We don't know enough about tall buildings. We do nothing on marine permaculture. So added many new chapters, and also the latest knowledge, trying to work with the Decade of Ecosystem Restoration and also with the SDGs where appropriate. So trying to be a little future looking and integrate with others. I don't even think I'll read it myself, really.
You've written it and read it and edited it. You've done it. I know how much you've been working on it.
I'm a bit sick of it at the moment. 2 years is enough.
Oh, my gosh, that is a long time. So hopefully it's coming out soon. Yeah.
Thank you very much for asking me on the session. Great people with lovely comments and some old friends there. So it's been a very rich system, and I love your work and hope to be working with you again sometime on and offline.
Yeah.
Thank you. And for everyone who tuned in, but especially people in refugee camps, those people who tuned in today, you are valuable and wanted and doing key work, and you're brave and good and marvellous. Thank you.